A couple of maybe controversial questions. What do you usually say to someone who says climate change is a hoax? Where a lot of people are of the opinion that the United Nations is a scam.
The UN is very, very intimidating. You have multiple different negotiations going on in parallel over a course of 2 weeks. So if you don't understand what's happening, in addition to all of these factors, you're just going to be very, very drained and you're never going to come back because it's very off-putting. Especially now that we've been doing this for 28 years. I mean, a lot of people go like, what are you even negotiating upon? It's always a catch-22 situation. Countries are willing to do the bare minimum so that they don't look like the bad guy. There are very few countries who are genuinely progressive. And while there was a lot of criticism that India faced, I think it comes from a valid point of, as a country today, 70% of our energy comes from coal. We're not capable, as of today, to completely move out of fossil fuels. We're transitioning, but we don't have the capacity to say, okay, we're going to phase out of fossil fuels.
Hello everyone and welcome to a fabulous episode of Sephra's Green and Greener Show. I am your host, Sephra Abraham, and today I'm joined by Heeta Lakhani. She is a climate advocate, entrepreneur, and has done so many special things in her life. I'm so excited to talk to her. Hi Heeta, how are you doing?
Hi Sephra, I'm doing great. Thank you so much for having me today. It's absolutely lovely to be here with you.
Thank you so much for being here. Heeta is a girl with a lot of things to do. She's super busy, so we'll get right into it. Okay, Heeta, tell me about you. I know it's a deep question, but I want to know, who is Heeta Lakhani, and if you can give us a short but insightful introduction about yourself.
Well, I think for me, ever since I was a child, I think I wanted to do something with nature. I didn't know what it was. And I think around the age of 11, 12, something like that, I heard for the first time the term called environmentalist. Because I think someone just jokingly told me that if you like nature so much, you should be an environmentalist. And I took it very seriously. And I kept telling everyone that this is what I'm going to be when I grow up without even understanding anything about what the word meant. But yeah, I mean, basically, as I studied, like, different things evolved. And I did eventually do a master's in environmental studies. And then I studied German and I worked as a German translator for a year. So I did nothing with the environment for a while. But I think it was around 2015 and I was just trying to see what was going on. I just finished my master's and I wanted to actually get into the space of environment. It was a nice, comfortable job, but it wasn't my calling. And that's when I was actually introduced to the UN climate change process. And that took a nice detour. I got more involved in youth action, met young people from across the world, eventually got into climate education, and now work on training young negotiators for the UN climate change process. And in India, I also work on training young people to be basically to take action. So using education as a tool to drive climate action on the ground.
Wow. Okay, we're joined here by literal, I think, climate royalty. You know, in your introduction, you spoke a little bit about youth in climate. And I think that's a very hot topic today, and it's something that everyone should be talking about. So, I want to begin by asking you about the youth participation in climate advocacy, broadly. So, since you started when you were so young, why do you think there is a need for the youth today to be vocal?
Well, I think one is very, very simple, right? One is that we're inheriting a planet which is not in the best of conditions, not in the best of health. And unfortunately, we have to live with the impacts that we're creating. And a lot of it is not, like, the children today are not responsible for the emissions, but they're having to live a life over the next few decades where the impact of climate change is going to be very, very prevalent in their lives. So I think one is just that. But I think the second is also that as young people, there's a lot of innovation, there's different ways of thinking. And sometimes we don't necessarily go by just the way systems have been working. Slightly being a little rebellious or being, little out of the box helps to bring in innovation, helps to bring in new ideas. And I think climate change is an issue where it goes beyond generations. It goes beyond a particular work stream or a particular career path or anything else. So I think just bringing in different people with different interests, whether it's from the arts to science to law to architecture to whatever that might be, right? To think about the problem from different sides. And this is something that young people are really good at just because we can question certain ways of working.
Right. I think that makes complete sense. And, as trying to be involved in the youth movement myself, I think you've spoken a lot of facts, right? So going into a little bit about, you mixed your love for the environment with your professional life. and I see that you run Youth Negotiators Academy. What is that?
So, the Youth Negotiators Academy is basically a space where we work with countries from across the world, and we train young people to be negotiators at the most important spaces. And we started with the Climate Youth Negotiator program, which is our pilot program. It's in its second year now, where we train young people to be negotiators for their countries at the UN climate change negotiations. So basically, it's not just training young people and bringing them to the UN negotiations, or the COP as we call it, but really giving them a seat at the table. So we get a buy-in with the country before we bring in the young people, so that the country has agreed that this person will have a negotiating mandate. They will have a role to play. They won't be there to like take notes or bring me coffee or like, whatever, run around for whatever reason. But they will have a mandate like anybody else, will be sitting in the rooms with their counterparts and making these decisions for their country. So that's what we're doing with the Youth Negotiators Academy.
Wow, that's pretty impressive. So, you brought up the COP, right? So if you can explain to people who are listening in, because I feel like terms like these, conferences can be alienating to the general public or to anyone that's randomly listening. So if you can give me a little bit about what is the COP and what happens at these events that you are preparing the youth to attend.
Yeah. So for terminology, the COP is it's basically short for Conference of Parties, which is why it's called COP or COP. Now, this specific contest, in the context of climate change, we're talking about COPs that happen under the UN climate change body, which is in short known as the UNFCCC, or the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change. So it's either spoken in either as the UN climate change or the UNFCCC in short. So that might come up a few times in the conversation. Now, the Conference of Parties, basically, a party is a country that is a party to this convention. So that has signed up to this convention. So 197 countries are party to the UN Climate Change Convention, which is why a Conference of the Parties. Historically, it started in 1992, and now we're at COP28 this year. So since 28 years, or basically there have been 28 COPs that have been going on. Of course, in the pandemic, it didn't happen, so the numbers don't necessarily align with the years, but we're now at the 28th session of the Conference of Parties. And the aim is for countries to come together to try and address the global issue of climate change. Now, this doesn't happen through just meetings, it happens through a series of negotiations. It is basically a space for negotiation, which means that countries come in with their positions. When you go into a negotiation, you have your position, you have your your agenda on what you want to achieve out of it. But then, of course, you have a leeway in between, right? So you go in with your most ideal expectation, but then you have a space of like, how much can I, like, what is my red line? How much can I move across? And then how much do I not want to, like, what is my base? And like, that is it. Like, I need to come out with something. So that's usually the play area. So each country, which you can imagine, like the complications just get worse with 197 countries with their own different issues. Climate change is slowly becoming a top priority for most countries, but it is not always the highest priority. So each country has its own priority, has its own agendas, and then they come together to identify where is the common ground that we can work on. So the negotiations currently that we're talking about is about an agreement that happened that came across in 2015, which is known as the Paris Agreement, because it was signed in Paris. And the reason why this agreement is historical is because 197 countries actually agreed on every single word in the text. So right from a the to the comma to the and to a full stop, everything can be negotiated upon. So countries can really, it goes into layers and layers and layers of complexity and detail. So which is why this agreement is very, very historic. And now we're moving into a phase is basically, now the Paris Agreement basically came into force in 2020 or 2021. At the conference, which was COP26 in Glasgow, and now we're in the so-called implementation phase. So now we have an agreement. How a country is going to take this back into their country? What is it going to look like from a global agreement to a national, for example, policy or process? And each country is, of course, going to look very different. So that's the phase we're in, and this is the main implementation bit that countries are still negotiating upon.
Right. Wow, that's a lot of information, to give us. Thank you so much for that, by the way. I think a lot of people are confused, or maybe it was just me. I don't know. Could be.
It is. The UN is a world of its own.
Isn't it? And I really feel like the terminology changing every year. I get it. Like, they're trying to be as proper about it as they can, introduce new terms and be inclusive and get these many countries together. But I think, not everyone is able to understand what exactly is happening. So I also read about the UN climate change process. Is that any different from what you've already spoken about, or is that a new chapter in itself?
No, it's basically the same process within the UN climate change. So, what is the different elements of the process? Basically, the things that happen actually behind the scenes or within the room. So, that's basically that's just where we try and engage our young people to make sure that they've got the thematic knowledge, they've understood the technicalities. It's going into already, say, walking into a fully fledged operationing master's degree program, trying to figure out just along the way, like in the dark, like trying to see what's going on. So a lot of it, there's absolutely no training out there that trains, there are different individual trainings, but there's no like one global training that trains people to be negotiators, and especially doesn't train young people to be negotiators. There are a couple of national programs, or now a few regional programs that have come up, but when we started last year, ours was the first global initiative to bring in young people to train, to understand different cultural perspectives, right from countries from say Latin America or Africa to islands in the Pacific and the Caribbean. Climate change is very, very different individually for each of these countries. So that's what we're trying to do, really build a community of young negotiators, and of course make them technically sound, because you're sitting in a room with negotiators who've been there for the past 28 years for 28 COPs. So how do you get that historical knowledge when you're there as well?
And I have to ask you, how has that experience been since 2022 to now? I'm sure you've interacted with a lot of young people and have enabled them and given them the tools to, be at that platform with the others. How has the experience been?
It's been, well, in one word, it's been very exciting, but it's also been very hard. Like, there's different layers of challenges. When I started my first COP in 2015 in Paris, I had zero training. I didn't know what I was going into. Someone gave me a badge for a week, and like that was it. So I spent a month's salary on like just going to Paris for 10 days and came back home. And it was nice. If that wouldn't have happened, I probably wouldn't have gone and like quit my job and done basically it. It was a good trajectory for me. But in terms of my contribution to that COP, I don't think I did anything valuable. I probably just increased carbon emissions by flying across the world. So I think this is something that I wanted to, especially when we put together the program, this was something that specifically I wanted to make sure that we don't just bring in young people who are very lost, who don't understand what's going on, because the UN is very, very intimidating. It's exhausting, it's overwhelming. You have multiple different negotiations going on in parallel over a course of 2 weeks, and you're exhausted by the end of it. You've barely had time to eat, you don't get enough sleep, you're on your feet, you're walking at least 20,000 steps, a minimum every day. So if you don't understand what's happening, in addition to all of these factors, you're just going to be very, very drained, and you're never going to come back. You're not going to engage again because it's very off-putting. So how do you try and break across that? And what worked for me was eventually making friends in the space, like building a community and making a space that actually made me excited to like go there. Having someone to talk to when the day is very overwhelming, or just, making sure that you're checking in on somebody. Hi, have you had breakfast today? Or, the other way, like someone checking in on you. So I think that's one of the biggest issues that we wanted to try and address is training, yes, of course. But beyond that, like how do you build a community that can be there for each other despite all the madness and the very, very cold rooms? How do you bring in a little bit of warmth inside to change the atmosphere a little bit?
I have a couple of maybe controversial questions, right? The first one being, there are a lot of naysayers. Okay, first let's start with the naysayers for the climate. Okay, what do you usually say to someone who says climate change is a hoax?
Well, I think at one point, I think the way that I've tried to deal with it is just you present the facts. A lot of the times, of course, they're not taken into consideration because people only accept facts that sit with your belief system. So it's very hard for that to change. And I think at one point you just let it go, because I think they're more and more in a minority today than the people who not just say actively believe that climate change is real and want to do something about it, but at least there are a lot more people who are moving on the other side of the fence saying, okay, I think this is happening, like it's not just something that we're hearing in science fiction anymore. And because more and more countries, even developed countries across the world, are facing impacts of climate change, we're seeing wildfires, we're seeing floods, we're seeing storms, we're seeing all kinds of impacts happening not just in Africa or in India or in China or in Asia, but you're seeing it in Europe, you're seeing it in the US. And this is where I think people are actually now coming to terms with it slightly. So I think it's lesser of an issue of someone who says, I don't believe in climate change. There's still, I think that's a much smaller number than people who actually think about it as an actual issue and want to do something about it.
I mean, I think that's a fair answer. So, coming more into the the United Nations, okay, it would be wrong of me to not ask you about maybe the opposing side of the argument, right? Where a lot of people are of the opinion that the United Nations is a scam, where they're like, oh, these people in their suits and their coats sit in an air-conditioned room and make decisions that could impact or try to make decisions that could impact millions and billions of people, but actually when it comes to doing stuff, they do nothing. Yeah. So what is Heeta's take on this?
Yeah, I think that's a lovely question, because that's such a valid concern that people have, right? And especially now that we've been doing this for 28 years, I mean, a lot of people go like, what are you even negotiating upon? So I think that's the whole point, is really to try and understand how the system works. And the UN Climate Change, or the UNFCCC, is basically a convening body. So their role in the whole process is of a secretariat, which means that, and it is called the secretariat, which means that they bring together countries, they provide a space, they provide technical support, but the UN does not make decisions. And the COP is a space where decisions come across, but that happens because the decision-making process within the UN is called an intergovernmental decision-making process, which means that governments across the world make decisions. So if I just happen to walk in and I'm not part of a country government, I can't make decisions. It is the national governments and their delegations who are appointed by countries who come there, who make the decisions for their countries and for the rest of the world. But that doesn't mean that, there's no point of getting to a COP. And I think this is the reason, and this is the sort of important bit, is we need to ensure that we bring in representation in various forms. One is, of course, representation in decision making. What we're doing through the Youth Negotiators Academy is try and bring in diversity within the negotiating tables, like within the rooms itself, so to bring in different voices at the table. But then, of course, these people are negotiating the positions of their country. There is a lot, it looks different for each country, where the young person would ideally be involved earlier, and that's what we're trying, is that they come in much earlier. So our training begins 6 months before the COP actually happens, so they have time to understand their delegation. They have time, there's wiggle room to, already make changes in how country positions are set. When countries come to a COP, their country positions are set already a couple of weeks or maybe a month before COP as well. So coming into a COP and saying, I'm going to try and advocate for change, is already probably a bit too late. So I think this is where, as young people, or even if you want to bring in different kinds of diversity, say women or indigenous people or people of color or different genders or whatever that might be, right? Bring in farmers, bring in business representatives, whatever that might be, in the whole world of trying to say, when we say diversity is not just young people. So how do you try and bring in voices that actually can affect? And this can be through advocacy. So to do advocacy, you need to still understand the technicalities. You need to know what the framework looks like, and what is the space where you can try and engage with. Who are the people that you can work with? Which countries have positions that might probably be favorable, that you can try and push for change. For example, if you want to work on human rights, you will not go to a certain group of countries because you know that their position on human rights is very different. You will go to countries that are slightly more progressive. So you need to know the dynamics of the space to be able to advocate and sort of push for certain things. So that is one side of things. And finally, when the decision making is made, rightfully so, yes, it's sometimes very, very cut off from reality. It's very cut off because you're getting people from 197 countries to come sit there. Most of the time this happens in the winter, so people are very cold. And then the whole concept of global warming is forgotten because you're sitting in air-conditioned rooms. And I think this is where, when I spoke about bringing in diversity, this is why you need to ensure diversity, because the people that are affected by climate change, who feel the impacts of climate change on the ground, in some way need to have the capacity, the resources and the training to be able to go there and make that sort of change. So they need to be able to know how to work in that system. It's not just about funding a bunch of people and bringing them to COP, but it's really about how do you build their capacity so that when they are at COP, after all the funding and the resource mobilization, when they are at COP, their time is used in the best possible way to navigate and bring in that change. So I think there's multiple ways of looking at it. And it is a slow system. It takes ages for 197 countries to find consensus and move forward. Decisions are made not on majority like the Security Council or at other places, and not by voting, but it's made by consensus, which means that every country has to agree to everything in the text to go forward. So it takes forever, but I think of it as sort of the mothership that sort of is moving. It's only going to move as fast as we sort of row. But if the ship is still going to be there, if we're not rowing fast enough, we're not going to move in any direction. So this is where the role of the governments come in. Is really how progressive do we want to be? How quickly do we want to make change? And the UN is sort of the ship that brings people together, but it doesn't really impact what direction you're going in, or doesn't really sort of make decisions for you.
Got it. I think that makes sense, because I think a lot of people keep having that question about the UN. I mean, not just in terms of climate, in terms of every other issue also, which we don't have to touch upon, but I know you know what I mean. So speaking of another, controversial sort of topic, it's been in the news for the last couple of years, where the West, let's say, puts these, or is trying to put sanctions on developing countries like India and China, right? And then India and China fight back saying that, hey, you had your time to develop and we didn't. So this is really unfair of what's happening. So what's your take on that? And having been on ground, witnessing it firsthand at the UN, what is actually happening in that East versus West sort of debate?
So I think one of the basic principles of the UN climate change, the charter that was made on, it talks about addressing climate change in what we call a CBDRRC, which is short for Common but Differentiated Responsibilities and Respective Capabilities. A lot of long words. What it basically means is that we all have a common responsibility, but we have different capabilities of reaching that responsibility, which means that the developed countries have a higher stake, one, because they have the financial resources to do something about it, but two, because historically they were higher emitters. The issues that we're facing today is because historically the developed world developed using coal, oil, natural gas, and whatever else that you call as sort of polluting today. And the role of the developing countries, India, China, and most of the world, is basically, in terms of historical emissions, is very, very low. But in terms of impacts, is very high, because we're the first ones to face impacts of climate change. So really, how do we try and address the picture, coming from very different viewpoints, but how do we come in together on a common perspective? And this is where the whole debate of like who pays, who's responsible for emissions, who should be doing more, especially when it comes to finances or when it comes to mitigation. For example, mitigation is basically reducing emissions. And which is why a lot of the narrative is currently the polluters are the developing world. India, China are the biggest economies, but in addition to India and China, most of the developing world is now using natural resources or using coal, oil, or fossil fuels to develop. And in case of today's emissions, of course, it's much higher emissions than the developed world. So I think it's really just trying to understand basically that's the constant debate on India and China saying, okay, we need to develop. Telling us not to develop is not okay. Our people, we don't have jobs, we have poverty, we have a million different issues, which doesn't exist in some parts of the world at all, at least not to the extent where we see it today. So how do we come across that if we don't develop ourselves? So there are different ways of looking at it, especially when it comes to finance, and this year's COP is going to focus on it. Last year they made a historic decision which says that for loss and damage, which basically means that when impacts of climate change are felt, when there is a flood or a hurricane, for example, the loss and the damage that has happened, economic loss, loss of life, loss of property, all of that, who really pays for that? Who is going to ensure that that community or country or whatever has the resources to deal with that loss and damage? And eventually, as the climate crisis is getting worse, this loss and damage is just going to go up. So who has the capacity, or who's actually responsible for a collective fund? And last year they decided that, okay, we will have a fund for loss and damage. That was the historic decision, that they just said that we will agree to have a fund where somebody, we don't know who, but somebody will put in money, where this fund is going to be held. All of that are basically the discussions, that the nitty-gritties of that is now what is coming in this year. So it's very, very important now to see where the finance is coming from, who's going to pay. Is it going to be the global north or the developed world, as we call it? Is it going to be developing countries like India and China, or like economies that are contributing to the climate crisis, or basically adding on to the climate crisis today? So it's a lot of different issues, and I think it's always a catch-22 situation. I think countries are willing to do the bare minimum so that they don't look like the bad guy. And it's not just one part of the world or another. I think most countries across the world are willing to do the bare minimum to not look bad. There are very few countries who are genuinely progressive, genuinely want to do something, and genuinely care about the issue deeply. And a lot of it is, of course, the small island states, because their countries are probably not going to be existing in a few years' time if we don't do something. And then, of course, there are other countries who are also, changing and sort of moving towards different ways of working. So yeah, very long answer to your question. But in a nutshell, I think to wrap all of this up, I think in a nutshell, it is really... so when the debate actually started at COP21 was where the language was, we want to phase out of fossil fuels, which means that over a few years, we will not use fossil fuels anymore. And India injected in the negotiations, came up right at the end of the closing after 2 intense weeks and says, we want to change this from phase out to phase down, which means that you reduce, but it's not an out. And while there was a lot of criticism that India faced, I think it comes from a valid point of, as a country today, 70% of our energy comes from coal. We're not capable, as of today, to completely move out of fossil fuels. We're transitioning, but we don't have the capacity as of today to say, okay, we're going to phase out of fossil fuels. And I think that's where it came from. But of course, that doesn't mean to say that we just don't do it. I think we have to keep thinking and keep being more progressive to say, how do we be a leader despite having the odds against us at some point?
Right. I think that's a fairly... you've given us both sides to think about, and I think that's very important when talking about climate negotiations between East versus West or developed versus developing. So thank you for that. And I know I've asked you a lot of questions about this, but I have another one, okay? And I want to know your take on India, zooming in into India, right? So over the years that, you've been involved for so many years now with the COP and with different climate negotiations, how has India been faring? Right? Because to add a little bit more context to that question, because I think what we've heard is that we do some really good things, but then we do many bad things, and then it's a constant cycle of, phasing in, phasing out, not agreeing to certain things as we just discussed. So is India overall performing and achieving its climate goals, or is there a lot to be done? I want Heeta's perspective on this.
So, well, I think personal perspective, this is not the position of the national government, because I don't. But I think there are different ways of looking at it. So in 2015 or 2016, basically, when India committed what we're going to do, after the Paris Agreement was signed, in 2016, this agreement was ratified. Basically, that countries agreed to, doing a few things. And each country set down its set of NDCs, or nationally determined contributions. So as the word suggests, each country determines nationally what its contribution is going to be in the fight of climate change. And this looks very different from country to country. So India's NDCs had a certain things, had different areas of what they wanted to do in terms of climate mitigation, in terms of climate adaptation, and looking at then the breakdown of what that was looking like. Now, as per our NDCs, India, considering its economy, considering its size, considering its per capita emissions, all of that, India had a relatively progressive NDC, which meant that, what our commitments are actually slightly better than most of the world. It's not the best, but it was on the sort of brighter scale of things. And as a country, the government does claim that we've already sort of achieved our NDC targets ahead of time, or at least most of the big NDC targets ahead of time. So on paper, yes, I think we're doing decently well, but I think there's always scope for more, especially in a situation as important as climate change, and in a country which is not just diverse, but is also facing the impacts firsthand, right? We're seeing developmental failures now over time, with different kinds of flooding and dam breakdowns and all kinds of things happening in the mountains in the north. Plus adding on is the impacts of climate change with floods and with hurricanes and, weather patterns being amiss with going to lead to food security, to all kinds of issues. I think there is a lot more that can be done, especially in terms of adapting to climate change. Mitigating is one thing, but I think what is a bigger priority, or what should be a bigger priority for India, is really how do you adapt to the impacts of climate change. So not that the impacts that you're seeing today, but how do you try and understand what the impacts might be over the next 5 years, 10 years, 20 years, to make planning long term. And the challenge is when we have governments, they think on a 5-year plan. Climate change doesn't work on a 5-year plan. So you need to be able to think way ahead of the future to be able to plan for something that's going to happen 20 years later. And all of our urban planning, city planning, even national level policies are made from when my party is in, how do I keep my party in power, and how much will I get, what is the impact I will see in the years that I'm going to be in power. So if 5 years time, if there's going to be somebody else in power, we don't really care about the impacts then. So I think that is the sort of self-detrimental issue where it comes down to like grassroots implementation of policies. But I think otherwise, at least on paper, on an international scale, we're doing fairly okay. But in implementation, there's a lot more that we can do to really be the champion and sort of make change as a country, which is not just as populated, but has diversity in terms of sort of ecological diversity in culture, in food, in so many different ways that we can. I mean, it complicates the problem, but it also can bring in so many different solutions from the ground in so many different ways.